All right. Well, thanks for coming. I will we'll start with a famous prayer by Erasmus of Rotterdam, whom some of you might know. He's sort of a contemporary and counterpart to Luther. And Erasmus famously said, "Sancte Socrates, ora pro nobis." So pray for us, Saint Socrates. So that's sort of a very tenuous connection here to Christian mysticism. And just to let you know that I didn't sort of butt into this here, but I sort of slipped into this presentation because Elaine and Amy were talking about Rembrandt and Hildegard, and I thought they were talking about heroes or inspirational figures. And I think you said, "Well, who's yours?" And I said, "Socrates." And then you said, "Oh, good, you're signed up for giving a presentation." And then I found out it was a presentation about Christian mysticism, which of course with Socrates is a stretch. And actually, I'm going to stretch it even a little further, because when you look at the figure of Socrates, there isn't a lot of mysticism in there. He's got sort of a divine voice that says no, when he shouldn't do something. But otherwise, of course, Socrates is very rational. He's a great citizen. He obeys the laws, and he thinks through stuff, and he has lots of conversations. But then Plato, of course, who is the student of Socrates, does have many more aspects to his thinking that are mystical. And he uses Socrates as a mouthpiece to present these views. So this isn't terribly important, but people usually distinguish, Socrates and Plato as really two somewhat different philosophers. And what we'll look at today is just 2 pages of a dialogue called Phaedrus, which is sort of a middle to late dialogue, they call it, by Plato, which means he has moved away from some of the original Socratic thinking, and he's adding new ideas to what Socrates must have thought. And of course, we don't know anything. Socrates, like Jesus, like the Buddha, didn't write anything down. At the end of this dialogue, we're not going to talk about it today, at this end of this dialogue, Socrates talks about how it's a bad idea to write things down. And then Plato, writes this down. Right. So it is really fascinating to me, actually, that Socrates, just like these other 2 great thinkers, did not believe that writing things down was the way to go, because he thought it was in the individual interaction, in the ad hominem, with another person, that truth would arise. So in this dialogue, the Phaedrus, Socrates, used by Plato, talks about the soul. And the reason why I wanted to look at this dialogue is because this dialogue talks about what a soul experience feels like and what a soul experience is. And you'll see that one could certainly call that mystical, because it breaks through all the boundaries of normal, logical, rational life experience. So the soul metaphor in this dialogue is that the soul is like a charioteer with 2 horses riding around a big sort of circular space, and inside of the circular space is truth, right? Goodness and beauty and justice and all these things. And the soul sort of rides around this place beyond heaven, he calls it. And depending how good the charioteer is in controlling the bad horse, because one horse is bad and the other horse is good, the soul either sees a lot of these truths or not so many. And so then when the soul at some point loses its wings and gets dropped into a body, a human body, it either has or has not a lot of memories of truth and goodness and beauty and all those things. So that explains why some of us see more truth and more beauty, and others see less of it. But the soul is really important for Plato. For Socrates, it's kind of important, but Socrates, he's agnostic about the afterlife and the soul. He would do the same thing if he died and there's nothing afterwards. But Plato really stresses the immortality of the soul. And that's all I want to say as an introduction. And then if you can just turn to 525. at the top of the page. And I thought we'd sort of read a paragraph at a time, and then you throw out whatever questions you have. And I hope to get through 2 pages. That might be ambitious, but we'll just see how far we can go. I'll read the first paragraph, and then maybe we can just go around afterwards. So he had talked about how the soul has wings, and now he talks about what happens when the soul loses its wings, because when it's in us, it only has sort of little stumps, right? But the wings are no longer there when the soul is in the human body. So Plato here, through Socrates, says, let us turn to what causes the shedding of the wings, what makes them fall away from a soul. It is something of this sort. By their nature, wings have the power to lift up heavy things and raise them aloft, where the gods all dwell. And so, more than anything that pertains to the body, they are akin to the divine, which has beauty, wisdom, goodness, and everything of that sort. These nourish the soul's wings, which grow best in their presence. But foulness and ugliness make the wings shrink and disappear. So that's one of the main thoughts sort of that Plato brings in, that the soul is nourished by its, when it's in the presence of goodness, truth, beauty, and all this, and when it's not, then the soul shrinks. And so all of Plato's thinking is sort of designed to increase our interaction with beautiful things in order to give the soul some lift. Do you mind reading the next paragraph, and we'll just go around?
Now Zeus, the great commander in heaven, drives his winged chariot first in the procession, looking after everything and putting all things in order. Following him is an army of gods and spirits arranged in 11 sections. Hestia is the only one who remains at the home of the gods. All the rest of the 12 are lined up in formation, each god in command of the unit to which he is assigned. Inside heaven are many wonderful places from which to look, and many aisles which the blessed gods take up and back, each seeing to his own work, while anyone who is able and wishes to do so follows along, since jealousy has no place in the gods' chorus. When they go to feast at the banquet, they have a steep climb to the high tier at the rim of heaven. On this slope, the gods' chariots move easily since they are balanced and well under control. But the other chariots barely make it.
And those are the chariots, sort of the non-divine, not driven by the gods.
Like the one my soul is.
The one that will drop into us, yeah.
The heaviness of the bad horse drags its charioteer toward the earth and weighs him down if he has failed to train it well. And this causes the most extreme toil and struggle that a soul will face. But when the souls we call immortals reach the top, they move outward and take their stand on the high ridge of heaven, where its circular motion carries them around as they stand while they gaze upon what is outside heaven.
So you can always jump in with questions. It's sort of like a weird carousel, right? Where you see some of the Zeus on his. Yeah, so it's Socrates would never go there, right? Because this is obviously, who knows. But Plato loves making up these myths because he thinks they will be motivating to people. Because Plato thought, well, they killed Socrates, so obviously Socrates' virtue teaching didn't take because it required too much self-discipline and too much, asked too much of the humans. And so then Plato gives us all these stories. And in the next paragraph, he describes this weird place beyond heaven.
The place beyond heaven. None of our earthly poets has ever sung or ever will sing its praises enough. Still, this is the way it is. Risky as it may be, you see, I must attempt to speak the truth, especially since the truth is my subject. What is in this place is without color and without shape and without solidarity. A being that really is what it is, the subject of our true knowledge, visible only to intelligence, the soul's steersman. Now a God's mind is nourished by intelligence and pure knowledge, as is the mind of my soul that is concerned to take in what is appropriate to it. And so it is delighted at last to be seeing what is real and watching what is true, feeding on all this and feeling wonderful until the circular motion brings it around to where it started. On the way around, it has a view of justice as it is. It has a view of self-control. It has a view of knowledge, not the knowledge that is close to change, that becomes different as it knows the different things which we consider real down here. No, it is the knowledge of what really is what it is. And when the soul has seen all the things that are as they are and feasted on them, it sinks back inside heaven and goes home. On its arrival, the charioteer staples the horses of the manger, throws in ambrosia, and gives them nectar to drink besides.
Thank you. That was, it's nice to read slowly. I think it's kind of a funny image in many ways, right? Like the horse, and then, just puts in the stable, here's some ambrosia, and then the soul goes home and eats dinner or something. It's just so interesting the way that I think Plato presents this, this place beyond heaven. Nobody's ever talked about it, but I'll tell you how it really is. And so one of the things that people always talk about when they study Plato is, well, does he really mean this? Right? Is the whole Republic just an ironic argument? And so Plato is really fascinating to read because of all the imagery and all the metaphors. So he doesn't really sit still. He's not like reading Aristotle or an essayist who says, here's what I think. And then you always have to remember this is all in the context of a conversation that kicked off with this guy named Phaedrus giving Socrates a great speech that made Socrates say something that he regrets. And this is sort of Socrates's I'm making it up to the gods speech, because in the original Socratic speech, he had spoken poorly of Eros, right, which is a god. And so all of these things are in the background of these statements. So I was saying is we shouldn't make the mistake of saying, oh, this is silly, right? This can't be true. What is he doing? But I think we have to understand his imagery as sort of a pep talk to have more justice, more self-control, and more knowledge in our lives. And he's trying to argue that is what makes our souls truly happy. Right? Any of those things. So I just wanted to throw this out if you thought this was kind of wacko.
I've got it's not a lack of question. I tend to think more concretely than what this is. So we have lots of images of people die and they go to heaven and they have wings.
Yeah.
That we all become angels.
Right.
So is this where that comes from, that the soul has wings? Because it's, as far as I know, not in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm. Homer talks about this too, in Iliad, when somebody dies, right? The soul sort of goes out and flies down towards Hades. So I think it was probably a pretty common Greek notion.
The images stand that out. There's lots and lots of images of them. Often in funerary sculpture, there will be a soul bird that's flying away, right? They have a person who's the esteemed person who's died, and then the bird is coming out.
Yeah. But you are right to point out, and I hope this is where this is going as we keep reading, that the similarities of Platonic philosophy and Christian imagery is great. Right? There's a lot of overlap in terms of the immortality of the soul, in terms of trying to have self-control and knowledge and justice and all these kinds of things. So there really are a lot of things that Plato kicks off that Christianity then runs with. But he might not be the first one to talk about the wings of the soul.
I thought it was interesting you said risky as it may be. I mean, that was something that came up with Hildegard too, that it's like, it is a risk to like try and portray the afterlife or portray the world of the gods. So yeah, this just struck me.
Yes. I was kind of struck by it's also like I could read a whole I can read method into the whole thing, because he's talking about, we go through the effort to try and be good and climb the whole thing up, to the top to heaven, and then we rest in that, like eating of the food of like replenishing ourselves with the direct view, with the direct experience, and then we rest, and then it starts again. And I think, I don't know, I was just kind of hearing a method in there, as well as
like spiritual practice, you mean?
Yeah.
I think that's very much what Plato wants to encourage, is being in the presence of these rejuvenating, replenishing things, right? Whether it's justice or truth or goodness or beauty, that will be good for your soul. And he will talk about other things that are not good for the soul that you should avoid, because that's the bad horse win. So you always want to give the good horse a lot of nourishment and keep the bad horse under control. So,
but you still feed the bad horse and throw it.
You got to win it over, right? Because ultimately, the best rider has turned the bad horse, to his or her will, right? And the bad horse becomes no longer a force that pulls you away from truth and goodness and all these things.
It's the same thing about which wolf we feed.
Yeah. Or which angel on which shoulder.
That's what I thought too.
No, yeah, exactly right. A lot of these, and that's why I find, this is, as you probably all remember, Plato writes in the 4th century BC, right? So this is really pre a lot of these images that we're familiar with. And so I think in a lot of ways, we're at the source of many of the ways of thinking about soul and body and what is the good life. And it is risky in a way to write about something like this, because is this really true? You don't know, but Plato's pretty assertive about it. You might remember in the Apology when Socrates says at the end, when we're dead, it's either going to be lights out or there's going to be a continuation. I don't really know. Right? And then Plato really knows, right? So that's he takes that next step where he leaves his teacher behind, but he is still aware that he's ultimately making it up. So a lot of Platonic philosophy is very poetic, and Plato is aware of that, and he points it out in words like risky. Yeah.
So this is Plato.
So Plato is using, Socrates is talking here, and it's a long speech. So Plato writes a dialogue called Phaedrus, in which Socrates and Phaedrus go back and forth. But at this point, only Socrates is talking, but Plato is writing it.
But we don't think that Socrates actually said these things. Plato is just using Socrates' voice, or claiming Socrates said these things, right?
So that's how people distinguish between early dialogues, middle, and late dialogues. In the early dialogues, we think that Plato is essentially taking dictation from Socrates. So the Apology, that seems to be more or less what Socrates said at his trial. In the Crito, in several of these dialogues, we think that Plato is just taking down what Socrates said. And then later, he uses Socrates to say things that the original Socrates probably wouldn't have said. And at the very end of Plato's career, he actually has dialogues without Socrates in there. So you can see through his writing that he moves away from his teacher. Yeah. So this is Socrates talking, but we think that this is Plato making him say some things that the original Socrates might not have said. Yeah. On that note, if you wouldn't mind reading on.
Now that is the life of the gods. As for the other souls, one that follows a god most closely, making itself most like that god, raises the head of its charioteer up to the place outside and is carried around in circular motion with the others. Although distracted by the horses, this soul does have a view of reality, just barely. Another soul rises at one time and falls at another. And because its horses pull it violently in different directions, it sees some real things and misses others. The remaining souls are all eagerly straining to keep up, but are unable to rise. They are carried around below the surface, trampling and striking one another as each tries to get ahead of the others. The result is terribly noisy, very sweaty, and disorderly. Many souls are crippled by the incompetence of the drivers, and many wings break much of their plumage. After so much trouble, they all leave without having seen reality, uninitiated, and when they have gone, they will depend on what they think is nourishment, their own opinions.
That's so good.
That explains it, doesn't it? Yeah, it's making sense. Right. Yeah, so it's I don't know. It is kind of funny, right? It's a little bit like a combination of a horse race and a NASCAR race, and like things are bumping into each other. And but the more serious point is that if you don't have an understanding of reality with a capital R, then you're just going around saying stuff, right? And you're just making things up, and you just have opinions, and that is something that Plato feels very strongly about. That opinion isn't good enough, right? Opinion needs to have to be more than opinion. It needs to be aligned with capital R reality and capital T truth and those kind of things. And he's explaining in a way how that works. Yeah. Let's read on and see how. The next thing is about reincarnation. So there's a lot of interesting stuff here.
But even there is so much eagerness to see plain where truth stands, that this pasture has the grass that is the right for the best part of the soul. And it is the nature of the leaves that lift up the soul to be nourished by it. Besides the law of destiny is this: if any soul becomes a companion to a god and catches sight of any true thing, it will be unharmed until the next circuit. And if it is able to do this every time, it will always be safe. If, on the other hand, it does not see anything true because it could not keep up, and by some accident takes on a burden of forgetfulness and wrongdoing, then it is weighed down, sheds its wings, and falls to earth. At that point, according to the law, the soul is not born into a wild animal in its first incarnation, but a soul that has seen the most will be planted in the seed of a man who will become a lover of wisdom or of beauty, or who will be cultivated in the arts and prone to erotic love. The second sort of soul will be put into someone who will be a lawful king or a warlike commander. The third, a statesman, a manager of a household, or a financier. The fourth will be a trainer who loves exercises, or doctor who cures the body. The fifth will lead the life of a prophet or a priest of the mysteries. To the sixth, the life of a poet or some other representational artist is properly assigned. To the seventh, the life of a manual laborer or farmer. To the eighth, the career of a sophist or dogma and go into the night a tyrant.
Yeah. So he does a lot with these notions of, recycling the soul. And you're in fifth place there as a priest, so that's not bad. So he's got a lot of images in other dialogues too, where the souls are sitting around and they're getting to pick another life. And the uncontrolled souls, they usually pick lives of glamour and what have you that are not good. And Odysseus, one of the smartest guys, picks a life of simplicity and just, goodness. And so the souls will sort of be put into the life that they deserve. Or in other words, we get the life that we deserve based on our soul's quality. Yeah.
Or health almost, right?
The soul's health, yeah, that's right. How well we've taken care of it, right? Whether we've been able to keep up with the gods, right? So because if we keep up with the gods, then our souls will be good. But forgetfulness is one of the great sins for Plato, right? If we're forgetful, because according to Plato, we have all the knowledge we need, and the famous Platonic statement is that evil is ignorance, right? That we have sort of forgotten what is good. So evil is not some satanic force, but it's our forgetfulness. And so if we're attentive, if you keep up with the good and the God, then we'll be fine. But if not, then we'll be tyrannical. Or even worse, we'll be reincarnated as an animal. Then we can slowly work our way up again if we're a good animal. So I don't know how literally to take all this. I mean, I don't think Plato thought this was sort of 100% accurate.
Does sound like opinion.
Well, that's sort of the interesting question about Plato, right? I mean, he says on the previous page, no, this is how it really is, but how the heck would anybody know? Which is, again, then the part of Platonic philosophy that those of us who really like it enjoy, is that there is this irony in all of this. Like, how could anybody really know this? And yet he's so serious about it. And so Platonic dialogues are always sort of moving, as you're trying to understand them, because they might be very well undercutting themselves by either who's speaking. In this dialogue, Socrates leaves Athens for the only time in any dialogue. He's such an Athenian, and he seems to lose his way at first when he's outside of Athens. Yeah, he doesn't see the good and the true anymore, and he says things that he regrets. Yeah, so you're right. I mean, this does sound like somebody's making stuff up.
But it sounds like a making stuff up in order to describe something. Like some people are like closer to God or closer to truth and beauty than others.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's like creating an explanation for why some people are just like bumping into each other and fighting for silly things, and why other people seem to have more stability.
I think you're right. I mean, I think Socrates and Plato are ethically absolutely serious. And then, epistemologically, or in terms of the way they present how we know things, there's a lot of creativity. But I think as an ethical point, he's not just making things up. I think he is deadly serious, that if you are not connected to the good, your soul will suffer. And that's not an opinion as far as Plato is concerned.
And it seems to me that if I read it more literally, like he really believes this is everything that happens, it's a lot different than if I take this as one person's explanation of how humans are humans, and then so I could see me reading this and wanting to become a bit offended by this whole thing, but then also, if I think of it as just an explanation of humanity, then it's a lot more tolerable. I want to mention that I think that I'm going back when I saw this. It's been a long time, but it reminds me of reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, because wasn't it Phaedrus was the Robert Persic's alter ego? I think it was Phaedrus in that book.
Really?
It's really interesting because he has dialogues with himself as Phaedrus, and him, I think. Isn't it?
Platonic
Yeah. So it's pretty interesting. Now that makes more sense. That memory comes in and makes a little more sense reading
Yeah,
this.
that is nice. And your first point is absolutely well taken, because I think if we're literalists with Plato, I think then we do become, and we're fighting the wrong kind of battle. But if we're saying, oh, that's really interesting in terms of how we operate as human beings, then we're entering into the dialogue with Plato, and we can sort of push back, we can read another dialogue, and we can, remember that this is supposed to stimulate. I think that's one thing that people usually like about Plato, that he's very stimulating as a writer. He's one of the greatest poet philosophers ever. And so all the imagery, just like a poem, you wouldn't read a poem and work it out with a pencil and then say, ooh, I'm offended by this, but because, I mean, you could, but then you would not get the point of the poem, which is obviously beyond just black ink on the white piece of paper.
It's elevating or differentiating fact from truth, which we learned early in EFM.
Yeah.
Is this factual, or am I finding truth in this?
That's right.
I'm not going to get hung up on facts.
All of it is absolutely true, and some of it may have happened. Also, some of these descriptions remind me of the book of Revelation, a similar imagery and things.
Well, let's read on. There's a little more good stuff to come.
I've been asked the reading assignment.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Of all these, any who have led their lives with justice will change to a better fate, and any who have led theirs with injustice to a worse one. In fact, no soul returns to the place from which it came for 10,000 years, since its wings will not grow before them, except for the soul of a man who practices philosophy without guile, or who loves boys philosophically. If after the third cycle of 1,000 years, the last mentioned souls have chosen such a life 3 times in a row, they grow their wings back and they depart in the 3,000th year. As for the rest, once their first life is over, they come to judgment, and once judged, some are condemned to go to places of punishment beneath the earth and pay the full penalty for their injustice, while the others are lifted up by justice to a place in heaven where they live in the manner the life they led in human form has earned them. In the 1000th year, both groups arrive at a choice and allotment of second lives, and each soul chooses the life at once. From there, a human soul can enter a wild animal, and the soul that was once human can move from an animal to a human being again. But a soul that never saw the truth cannot take a human shape, since a human being must understand speech in terms of general forms, proceeding to bring many perceptions together into a reasoned unity. That process is the recollection of the things our soul saw when it was traveling with God, and when it disregarded the things we now call real and lifted up its head to what is truly real instead.
Well, yeah. So recollection is a big term for Plato, right? That learning is actually recollecting. So we're not making up new stuff, because the truth is already out there. And the more we recollect it, the more we approximate it, the better. But we're not creating it, we're recollecting it. So that's a really important term for Platonic philosophy. And these moments of recollection, and in the next paragraph, we'll see more of it. These moments of recollection are then maybe the closest that Plato comes to describing what a mystical experience feels like, right? When you are in the presence of something and you recollect you're traveling in that place beyond heaven and actually perceiving truth, reality, beauty, and now you're having an experience of truth and beauty here, and then that connection takes place, and that's really that's what ultimately Plato wants, those experiences. And I think maybe in the Christian context, one might call those mystical experiences. I do want to point out the notion that and that Socrates would agree with this, for Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, goodness and truth and a good soul are always earned. Right? There's no concept of grace. Right? You have to do the work as a human being. You have to choose what is good, and then you become good. So that's of course one of the big differences, maybe depending what kind of Christianity one subscribes to. But there's no you can't pray your way to the place beyond heaven. You have to rein in the bad horse. You have to feed the good horse. You have to work. Right? It's a very sweaty process, right? To be a good human being. So I just wanted to point that out in terms of, I don't want to Christianize Plato, Socrates too much here.
It's also a reminder that much as we may not recognize it sometimes or remember, according to this, everyone who is human today has had an experience of truth.
That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah.
So there's something we can work
That is what makes us human, right? That's the very definition of humanity, according to what we just read. So that's a good point.
And so that what you were just saying is, because I was just wondering as we were going through this about how it explains for quantum change, like someone who's going through a terrible life of an alcoholic, drug addict, etc. Suddenly they hit rock bottom and then becomes suddenly one of the best persons you would want to know. And they live a life of good for the rest of their life. So what this is saying in that sense is that they finally remembered something, I guess. Is that right?
The truth is in there. I think for Socrates and Plato, these sort of conversion experiences are maybe a little less likely, because this person would have habituated himself or herself to a life removed from reality and truth and goodness. So the more often you choose to do the wrong thing, the less likely it is that you will recollect. But it is still in there. So yeah, so I would argue that sort of for these Greek thinkers, conversions are less likely.
That's interesting. My mom would say, avoid occasions of sin. Because when you put yourself in a situation where you can do not the best choice, you're making it easier to do that, and easier, and similar thing.
Exactly the same thing. Yeah. So the I guess the carrot for this Platonic Aristotelian thinking is that you can habituate yourself to no longer covet your neighbor's wife. Right? You can actually change your nature to the degree that the bad angel is, sort of shrinks to almost to impotence, and you really only follow the good one. That's the goal of Greek virtue ethics, and it's the same idea, right? That obviously the first drink is not a big deal, right? But then it makes the second one easier, and right, and then you're down there, and then it's actually really hard to get back. And I think maybe Christianity offers sort of a conversion moment that you can come back that I think they would be somewhat skeptical about, even though you're right to say that deep down, but they would have to do some real digging because they've covered it up with so much, so much vice. The next paragraph, if you don't mind reading it, Martin, will give us a little more about he talks about this madness, right? This mystical experience of reconnecting with truth and beauty.
For just this reason, it is fair that only a philosopher's mind grows wings, since its memory always keeps it as close as possible to those realities by being close to which the gods are divine. A man who uses reminders of these things correctly is always the highest, most perfect level of initiation, and he is the only one who is perfect as perfect can be. He stands outside human concerns and draws close to the divine. Ordinary people think he is disturbed and rebuke him for this, unaware that he is possessed by God. Now this takes me to the whole point of my discussion of the fourth kind of madness, that which someone shows when he sees the beauty we have down here and is reminded of true beauty. Then he takes wing and flutters in his eagerness to rise up, but is unable to do so and he gazes aloft like a bird, paying no attention to what is down below. And that is what brings on him the charge that he has gone mad. This is the best and noblest of all the forms that possession by God can take for anyone who has it or is connected to it. And when someone who loves beautiful boys is touched by this madness, he is called a lover. As I said, nature requires that the soul of every human being has seen reality. Otherwise, no soul could have entered this sort of living thing. But not every soul is easily reminded of the reality, thereby what it finds here. Not souls that got only a brief glance at the reality there. Not souls who had just such bad luck when they fell down here that they were twisted by bad company into lives of injustice, so that they forgot the sacred objects they had seen before. Only a few remain whose memory is good enough, and they are startled when they see an image of what they saw up there. Then they are beside themselves, and their experience is beyond their comprehension, because they cannot fully grasp what it is that they are seeing.
Thank you. So this is the possession, right, by God. I mean, I think that's probably what people would call a divine and mystical experience. That is entirely possible for Plato, but you have to be a philosopher to have those experiences. And again, I mean, it has to be a lover of wisdom, not somebody who, like, an academic philosopher who, says stuff. But it has to be somebody who, truly loves wisdom and then experiences this kind of madness. So this is now getting us closer to what I wanted us to look at, this possession by God and this mystical experience, which I think is an interesting way. I don't know what Hildegard would say to this. But this is Plato's experience of or explanation of what we're really after in our lives, right? These are the high points in our existence. And we can train ourselves for that, right? By always being close, right, to the realities, and to use the reminders of these things correctly. And then we can become as perfect can be. Right? So this is another thing. There's no crooked timber of humanity or original sin or what have you, right? I mean, for these, obviously they're not naively optimistic, but Plato, Aristotle, Socrates would say you can become as perfect as can be. Very few people will accomplish that, but it is a possibility by being possessed by God, maybe 24/7 or as much as possible.
It sounds like recognizing beauty.
Yes.
Part of that.
Beauty is sort of the easiest one. He talks about this in the next paragraph, that beauty really is our most, is the best conduit to the realities of the divine. Self-control is more difficult, justice is more difficult, but through beauty is where we can get to this perfection, to this possession by the God, which I think is a really nice point. It might explain some of the things that Hildegard was writing down, or that Rembrandt was painting, or also how we probably try to educate our children and our students is not with a whip, right, but via beauty, right, because that has such a strong effect on the soul.
It reminds me of the big book. Yeah.
That's right. An experience of beauty, no matter where, right? Whether it's through Shakespeare or a walk in the Rocky Mountains or conversation with a neighbor or, a good run or whatever it is, right? Or that is an experience that elevates the soul.
The other connection to the Celts is that forgetfulness. Because the Celts think that we have always known these things. We have just forgotten.
Yeah.
I make that note. We talked about forgetting.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you literally remember, right? Like the soul has to be sort of put together, and yeah. Exactly. And so then this philosopher is reminded of true beauty, and he takes wings and flutters, right? So the inspired person is, but it can't fly, right? Because the wings are still off, but sort of the rudimentary parts of the wings are trying to go up, and that is sort of the mystical experience. The next paragraph is more about beauty, as you pointed out.
Justice and self-control do not shine out through their images down here, and neither do the other objects of the soul's admiration. The senses are so murky that only a few people are able to make out, with difficulty, the original of the likenesses they encounter here. But beauty was radiant to see at that time when the souls, along with the glorious chorus, Weaver with Zeus, while others followed other gods, saw that blessed and spectacular vision and were ushered into the mystery that we may rightly call the most blessed of all. And we who celebrated it were wholly perfect and free of all the troubles that awaited us in time to come. And we gazed in rapture at sacred revealed objects that were perfect and simple and unshakable and blissful. That was the ultimate vision, and we saw it in pure light because we were pure ourselves, not buried in this thing we are carrying around now, which we call a body, locked in it like an oyster as in its shell.
Yeah. So there's quite a bit of, body bad, soul good. And a lot of the dualism that we encounter in Christianity, certainly comes out of Plato.
Father Richard Gordon, his last day of seminary, he tells the story. A professor who'd been teaching them all for years walks out of the classroom, backs out of the classroom, and says, "Remember, last words he ever says, remember, Christianity has more to do with Plato than with Jesus." Wait. Now go on your way. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's, again, one can criticize Plato for that. Or one can read him a little less literally and say, it is clearly true that our bodies often get in the way of maybe more elevated experiences, right? I mean, if you're standing in front of a Rembrandt, but you really have to go to the restroom, right? You don't have an experience of beauty, right? Or if the knee really hurts, then the walk in the big book is also, so there's truth, of course, to our body's interference with elevating experiences. And so then, depending on how far one takes this dualism, one can certainly blame Plato, and one should blame, or one can also blame certain Christian body shaming and flagellation techniques that I think come out of this. I don't know that Plato wanted to go there. Socrates was famous. I mean, he was famously ugly, but he was also famously healthy. And strong, and as you probably know, the Greeks worshipped the human body, right? All these Apollo statues and Aphrodite statues, and so then I think Plato doesn't say the body is worthless, but he's saying the body is not as important as the soul.
It's actually,
No, please.
Plato has like a ladder of beauty of sorts that he made. And to him, it's sort of like you go up the ladder and you might be able to see true beauty because he has this whole thing of concepts and big finger imitation concept, which is another story. But to him, it's sort of like you might become a lover of bodies, but then you grow up and become sort of a lover of wisdom, minds, good laws, and stuff like that. So it's sort of like, at least I learned as Plato's ladder of beauty.
Yeah. You might be familiar with this famous David painting of Socrates as he drinks the hemlock and he points up. He's 70 years old and he looks like he just came out of the gym, after, upper body day. And so certainly the imagery of Socrates is one of a very healthy body. So I think intellectually one can maybe blame Plato for opening the door towards this dualism that Christianity runs with. But yeah.
Well, I think, yeah. Anything taken to extremes, we can use anything to shame ourselves and each other, and I don't think that's inherent in here.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, it's just the whole part of it makes me feel like that somehow the attention is the thing that's most important. It's like, do you care about that reality that you saw and recollect, or are you caring about the things that are distracting you? So I feel like the body could be incorporated into that. Like somehow you can have a body and love it, but if you're still like trying to flap your wings or trying to recollect those things, then somehow the body could be incorporated into that. But
the body actually has to be mastered in order to get as little in the way as possible, right? So for Socrates, I think Socrates would be in the gym. And there's a famous dialogue called the Symposium, which is a drinking party where they spend the whole night talking about, love and all the rest of it. And then everybody at the morning is sort of, tired. And Socrates sort of goes out, right? Because he is strong and he has his body under control. And there's a sense in which the body can become a hindrance or it become a vehicle towards goodness, depending on how you treat the body. Well, if you don't mind reading most of the next paragraph, and then we'll have to stop anyway, but this is, yeah. Actually stop at the second to last line. The word them, yeah.
Well, all that was the love of a memory that made me stretch out my speech in longing for the past. Now beauty, as I said, was radiant among the other objects. And now that we have come down here, we grasp it sparkling through the clearest of our senses. Vision, of course, is the sharpest of all of our bodily senses, although it does not see wisdom. It would awaken a terribly powerful love if an image of wisdom came through our sight as clearly as beauty does. And the same goes for other objects of inspired love. But now beauty alone has this privilege, to be the most clearly visible and the most loved. Of course, a man who was initiated long ago or who has become defiled is not to be moved abruptly from here to a vision of beauty itself when he sees what we call beauty here. So instead of gazing at the latter reverently, he surrenders to pleasure and sets out in the manner of the four-footed beast, eager to make babies and wallowing in vice. He goes after unnatural pleasure too, without a trace of fear or shame. A recent initiate, however, one who has seen much in heaven, when he sees the godlike face or bodily form that has captured beauty, well, first he shudders, and a fear comes over him like those he felt at the earlier time. Then he gazes at him, and with reverence due a god, and if he weren't afraid people would think him completely mad, he'd even sacrifice to his boy as if he were an image of God. Once he has looked at him, his chill gives way to sweating and a high fever, because the stream of beauty that pours into him through his eyes warms him up and waters the growth of his wings. Meanwhile, the heat warms him and melts the places where the wings once grew, places that were long ago closed off with hard scabs to keep the sprouts from coming back. But as nourishment flows in, the feather shafts swell and rush to grow from their roots beneath every part of the soul. Long ago, you see, the entire soul had wings. Now the whole soul seethes and breathes in this condition, like a child whose teeth are just starting to grow in and its gums are all aching and itching. That is exactly how the soul feels when it begins to grow wings. It swells up and aches and tingles as he grows them.
All right. So that's, yeah, like the teeth coming in, right? So it's painful and important and all the rest of it. Yeah, that I was just wanted to end with that because it's sort of the experience of the soul trying to grow wings. It is interesting, just as a side note, that the context of that really is sort of this Greek worship of the young boy, right? So there's this beautiful boy whom, according to Plato, you have to love philosophically, but obviously in the past that wasn't just always the case. But this is another one of those things that Plato is trying to shift away from being purely pederastic and more philosophical. But again, it's the search for beauty in that boy or in whatever else that you are seeing that is going to bring you that experience. To fly, right? To go towards the beauty with a capital B. So yeah, you can, if you have any more thoughts, you can throw them out or think this is entirely crazy. I didn't quite know what to do with, Socrates, Plato, the Christian mystic. But then as I thought about it, I thought this might be sort of the closest that, and we can see sort of, I think, in Christianity, the debt to some of these Platonic ideas. So maybe,
and I kind of think that there aren't any Christian mystics. I think they're just mystics, right? Because I think that the experience of God, when we have to use language or some means of communication, and that's all filtered throughout whatever the tradition is. But I think the experience itself is just a universal.
Yeah, and I think that's why, right? Because we all have a soul that is nourished by truth and goodness and beauty. And then depending on what context we're in, we're going to use different words to describe it. So I think that's a really good point there. The mystical experience of connection with the God or the good is a human experience. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love the way he describes the longing. It's like, this throbbing in the roots of your wings, like just because Christian mystics talk about that all the time, that how longing is actually the part of it. So it's like that realization, I can't fly, but I'd love to. Like that is in itself the experience of something greater.
Yeah, exactly. And sort of I know it from these Bach cantatas where the marriage with Jesus, right? This is also sort of described in great romantic language and longing for the union, right? Is maybe also similar in that respect.
I sort of, for some reason, when I first picked this up, I started reading this as if the failings of the addicted person and the recovery. And so this really made, perfect sense of that in a sense, because that person that has that whatever thing that brings them into the recovery process, suddenly they have, I used to work as an addictions counselor, so I'm real close to that. And suddenly they have this circle of people who have found their wings, so to speak, in the program. But it's so typical of somebody who starts in, because people will start in a recovery program and then they'll fail because of they're itching, they're itching to move forward and be perfect, and they're not ready for it yet, and that's why they have a sponsor. So it ties very well to that. I bet you anyone who's gone through that addictive process and recovery would read this in a real similar way to their experience.
And only if they habitually do stay away from the addiction will they slowly heal, right?
Yeah, and then they reach out to others and help them into the program. So it's really a perfect union, so to speak.
Well, thank you. I hope that was somewhat interesting.
Very. Thank you so much. Florian.
You're welcome.